few times. Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. This is the PDF that you can look at for yourself. I want to go over a few points in this. First of all, I want to make people to understand this. UNESCO, who is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, part of the UN, is discussing Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Now it says, since the 1970s, the field of bioethics has grown considerably. While it is true that bioethics today includes medical ethics issues, its originality lies in the fact that it goes much further than the various professional codes of ethics concerned. It entails reflection on societal changes and even on global balances brought about by scientific and technological developments, like the actual opposite of what they're taking into consideration today. Right? They want what they want, and when they argue what they want is best for everybody. So who cares what anybody says? Who cares what Americans want? Because this is best for you, and we don't care what you want. The balance of these things and society is the last thing they're thinking about, despite the fact that they're framing it as rebuilding society, but in ways that benefits them and the power structure. And of course, people that believe that owning nothing and existing within a society where the government controls every aspect of your life is somehow better. Sure, there are people that actually think that, but not the majority. The balance is the last thing they're considering. To their already difficult question posed by life scientists, how far can we go? Again, the last thing they're actually asking. Other queries must be added concerning the relationship between ethics, science, and freedom. Adopted by UNESCO's General Conference on October 19th, 2005. Okay? Signed by, it said where was it? Right here. Unanimously. After 2 years of intense work, the member states adopted unanimously the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, meaning that Israel signed it, the United States signed it, everybody in the UN, member states signed this, unanimously agreeing to what we're about to go over. So, as we go through this, ask yourself, if they signed this, and we go over the parts they're violating, are they doing so because they think it's best for you? Are they allowed to make that decision? And why isn't the rest of the world standing up and saying, well, look, you're doing that thing and it's completely violating the bioethics and human rights? Well, in first point, because seemingly more than half the world is doing so, which needs to make you begin to think that there's quite a larger thing going on than many realize. But jumping down to the points here, well, I think there were, let me just kind of flash through, conscious of the unique capacity of human rights to reflect upon their own existence and their environment, to perceive injustice, to avoid danger, to assume responsibility, to seek cooperation, and to exhibit moral sense that gives expression to ethic principles. I mean, even just as you go through, it just seems clear that these things are not human rights. The idea, it's about what they want and what they believe is best for you. So we're being told. Reflecting on the rapid developments in science and technology, which increasingly affect our understanding of life and life itself, resulting in a strong demand for a global response to the ethical implications of such developments. Right? Does anybody believe out there that they're considering the ethical implications of the genetically modifying things they're testing on humanity? Sure, they scream that it's for your best interest because you're in danger, but are they considering the ethical implications of pushing that in when there are other actions that could have been taken? Yeah, well, I'm just going to skip down to the actual points. I think there was some stuff in here, but I don't want to take too long, but I do want to read these points and go through all of them. General provisions, Article 1, scope. The Declaration addresses ethical issues related to medicine, life sciences, and associated technologies as applied to human beings, taking into account their social, legal, and environmental dimensions. The Declaration is addressed to states as appropriate and relevant. It also provides guidance to decisions or practices of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, corporations, public and private. Boilerplate. Told you. Article 2. The aims of this declaration are to provide a framework of principles and procedures to guide states in the formulation of their legislation, policies, and other instruments in the fields of bioethics, to guide actions, individuals, groups, communities, to promote respect for human dignity and protect human rights. I mean, right off the bat, to force someone to take something that they do not want to take, to inject somebody's body with chemicals that they do not agree to, can we just automatically out the gate agree that that violates their human rights, regardless of how safe or smart you think it is for the society? That point comes in a minute. By ensuring respect for human life, life of human beings, the fundamental freedoms consistent with international human rights law. Right there. What they're doing is not consistent with international human rights law. So a lot of the U.S. allies are not right now. To recognize the importance of freedom of scientific research and the benefits derived from scientific and technological developments, while stressing the need for such research and developments to occur within the framework of ethical principles set out by this declaration to respect human dignity, rights, and freedoms. Okay, I think that was the first part here. Okay, principles. Now this is where it gets important, especially when we get down to consent. Human dignity, human rights. Human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms are to be fully respected. Remember, the U.S. government already signed this back in 2005. The interest, and this is, well, I should have, in case it wasn't clear, I felt like it was, but what this is about in general is, as it says, a universal declaration in regard to the ethical practices in regard to sciences and research that are on the cutting edge, and whether, like, for instance, with bio manipulation and bio testing, such as the BSO4 labs that are creating bioweapons under the guise of making vaccines, right? That's unethical. What they're doing is putting people at risk. And it's in this document, it points out why it is. But that's what it's talking about. So the broader discussion of not just vaccines, but anything. New technologies, new research, and the ethical aspects of how it should go forward, and these principles that you have to follow, which they already agreed to. Now it says the interest of and welfare of the individual. This is so incredibly important right here. And in fact, this is probably the most important part of this. This is Article 3, human dignity and human rights. The interest and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society. Does that not directly counter the entire narrative that we're hearing? Right? I mean, the whole point is that society trumps the needs of the individual. Alan Dershowitz made this argument, the argument that there's a precedent in the courts back from 1918 or whatever it was, or before or after that, despite the fact that was repugnant to the Constitution when it was decided, which means it's null and void as the Constitution states before that, regardless. The interest and welfare of you as an individual have priority over the sole interest of science or society. So whether it's the interest of developing science or saving society, your individual rights and your freedoms have priority. The U.S. government signed this. So right now, knowing that they're forcing you to do things against your will, to force you to lock down or wear a mask even though you're not sick, right? Quarantining the healthy, which has never been done. That is literally violating this that they've already signed. Now we're just getting started. Article 4, benefit and harm. In applying and advocating scientific knowledge, medical practice and associated technologies, direct and indirect benefits to patients, research participants, and other affected individuals should be maximized, and any possible harm to such individuals should be minimized. Individuals should be maximized in regard to research. Is that happening now? Well, no, because they're saying you're in danger, so we don't need to do those things. And we're going to give immunity to the company making them because they're doing this for your safety, even though they're skipping the safety trials. Every time I say that, it's so stupid that I can't believe people buy this stuff. But benefit and harm. You don't get to say, pandemic, we're in danger, so skip all the safety things. Nope, they already signed this, and this is a universal UN worldwide agreement that they agreed to. What does that mean? They violate UN mandates and resolutions and agreements every 10 seconds, as far as I can tell. But nonetheless, the point is that they signed this and they're violating it. So it just gives you more legal standing as an individual if you find yourself going up in a legal battle, fighting for not wearing a mask or for locking down or for being forced a vaccine, which is happening more places around the world right now than make me comfortable. Not truthfully, a single one makes me comfortable, but there's so many examples of this right now where they're openly pushing for it. Denmark was one where it got shot down. Good news. But it's very clear that the government was saying, we want to be able to force you to take this vaccine. And yet that's being called fake news. The simple idea that anyone out there is trying to make it mandatory is that's crazy conspiracy theory. Because why? It causes vaccine hesitancy. We don't want you to think that. So it's okay for us to lie about that, even if it's true, because it's for your best interest. Journalism. But it says autonomy, individual responsibility, the autonomy of persons to make decisions, as in you. while taking responsibility for those decisions and respecting the autonomy of others is to be respected. While respecting the autonomy of others, meaning you have a choice. For persons who are not capable of exercising autonomy, say somebody who is in a coma, somebody who can't speak, somebody who is under the care of somebody else, special measures are to be taken to protect their rights and interests. Meaning you can't just force them to do it because it's in everyone's best interest. The autonomy of our individual choices takes precedent. As again, as a reference right here, the interest of the welfare and the individual take priority over society. It says, and this is the second most important part, consent. Any preventative, diagnostic, and therapeutic medical intervention is only to be carried out with prior, free, and informed consent of the person concerned, based on adequate information. Now, funny how they're freaking out on NBC over here about how we need to hurry and get them the information before it's too late because, as it says right here, there's a tight time frame to make sure they understand that because they're talking about informed consent. So you don't get to squeeze in a tight time frame and rush it. That's not informed consent. You don't get to dictate the time frame. I am the person who is possibly getting injected. I am the individual who has the right to come to the consent. I have the right to say, no, I don't want it because I don't feel informed on it. I don't feel I fully understand the information because you're flat out lying to us about the efficacy and how many people are being tested and whether placebos are being used with saline solution or meningitis vaccines or whether you're testing with PCR. I mean, they're lying and lying on top of lies on top of lies. And it's straight up telling you that you have the right. It says the consent should, where appropriate, be expressed and may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. So societal financial exclusion violates this mandate or agreement. You as an individual have the right, according to international law, to withdraw your consent to take any of these things for any reason at any time without disadvantage or prejudice, meaning you can't then be turned away from flying on an airplane, or you can't be turned away from a restaurant, or you can't be marked down on your social credit score. Yet they will do it, and it already is happening. I'm speechless every time I go through this because it's just so clear that they're violating almost every single part of this, and the whole thing is specifically about ethics. It is about the ethics of bio research and vaccines and science, and they're violating the ethics and your human rights. I hope this is very clear. You need to be able to understand that you can say no. And if they try to attack you for it or call you a conspiracy theorist or claim that you're going to be locked down or controlled or quarantined or whatever, penalized in any way, they are violating international law. Or, to call this flat out international law is a bit of a stretch, but we're talking about a universal declaration that was agreed upon by the United States. So at the very least, it makes them liars. It says scientific research should only be carried out with the prior, free, express, and informed consent of the person concerned. So again, you have a right to say, I feel uninformed. I have every right to do so. The information should be adequate, provided in a comprehensible form, and should include modalities for withdrawal of consent. None of these things are being considered. Then as they rush in information without telling everybody and act like that's informed consent, none of this makes sense. It says consent, again, it says, may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without any disadvantage or prejudice. First paragraph. You have the right to say no at any time for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. Exceptions to this principle should be made only in accordance with the ethical and legal standards adopted by the states. Right. So this is where you can get Dershowitz's argument, except the fact that we know that anything that violates the Constitution is null and void. So they cannot argue that they have the right to force you because society's benefit, because they list right up here that your priority is over society's priority, and there's no law that states that's the case, right? So boom, it's very clear. This is the reason these things work. It says consistent with the principles and provisions set out in the Declaration. So regardless, the point is, even if you go with the first part, what they're saying or what they're doing is simply not consistent with the principles and provisions in the Declaration. So right there, off the table. In particular, Article 27, International Human Rights Law. We'll get to these in a second. I probably will skip through these. I'm taking way too long on these, but these were the important ones. And I went real fast over this the last time. In appropriate cases of research carried out on a group of persons or a community, additional agreement of the legal representatives of the group or community concerned may be sought. I mean, these are like, there's extra layers of concern, of consent. And it's incredible how willing they are to just trash all of this because they're rebuilding everything. Didn't you know? In no case should a collective community agreement or the consent of a community leader or other authority substitute for an individual's informed consent. That could not be more clear how your informed consent and your ability to withdraw it is constant, never changing. Persons without, and this basically just makes the case that if you don't have the ability to consent, that it's the same concept of before in accordance with law and this resolution and the declaration. That you basically need to have the people that in charge of them need to basically give their consent. That's the point. And then it reasserts the same ideas. The research should be carried out for their direct benefit and the same ideas. Respect for human vulnerability and personal integrity. Right? So we know that there's people that are immunocompromised that won't be able to take the vaccine anyway. We know there are people that are all over the place that are being adversely affected by this, but it's not even their choice. And they don't consider these people. In applying, and they just make the argument that it's better for society, which, by the way, this declaration clearly states is not able to trump your personal rights. In applying and advancing scientific knowledge, medical practice, and associated technologies, human vulnerability should be taken into account. Individuals and groups of special vulnerability should be protected, and the personal integrity of such individuals respected. Now, the way I feel that is take that as vulnerability, like people who are immunocompromised in regard, or people who are adversely affected by the research or the science they're conducting, and on and on and on. Anyway, vulnerability is a pretty broad concept. I do not actually think that that's talking about social justice concepts. Actually, there's a part of that right down here in the next one. But that's how that kind of feels. But I actually believe they're talking about individuals that, let's say, are adversely affected by what's in a vaccine or so on. It says privacy and confidentiality. The privacy of the persons concerned. So think contact tracing, which is wildly, I mean, your privacy has been non-existent in this country since the Patriot Act, probably long before. And the confidentiality of the personal information should be respected. That's not happening. They'll tell you your neighbor won't get to see it, but they obviously need to see all your information because they're keeping you safe, and they need to know whether you're sick or whether the secondary vaccine is causing an effect or whether your neighbors are affected, right? That's pharmacovigilance, contact tracing, everybody. To the greatest extent possible, such information should not be used or disclosed for purposes other than those for which it was collected or consented to, such as, like the UK government selling your information from contact tracing to marketing firms, even though they told you it wouldn't happen, just like that. So the UK also violating this, obviously. Consistent with international law, none of these, they're violating these things left and right. They get into equity, justice, and equality and equity, just basically saying the equality of all human beings and dignity and rights respected. It says non-discrimination and non-stigmatization. No individual or group should be discriminated against or stigmatized on any grounds. Now, the way I take this, and this could apply in so many ways, because remember, this was in 2005, this was written, but no individual or group. So say people that they decide are anti-vaxxers, well, they're already violating that. And first of all, realize that anti-vaxxers, that they name it, is just anybody who's openly hesitant about this very dangerous vaccine. I mean, there are doctors who are openly pro-vaccine who are speaking out about this because there's obvious reasons to be concerned, and they're being labeled the anti-vaccine. Even though they're outspoken about the quality, the necessity and benefits of vaccines, because they say this one thing, suddenly they're anti-vax. That's because that's how dishonest and minimizing, reductive these ridiculous mainstream people are. So they're labeling everybody anti-vax. That becomes a group that's being discriminated against or stigmatized. It says on any grounds in violation of human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Of course, that just doesn't matter. They don't care about your freedoms. It's never been something they care about. Respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. Solidarity and cooperation. social responsibility and health. The promotion of health and social development for their people is a central purpose of governments that all sectors of society share. Taking into account that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, except that we have a sick care system that ultimately maintains your sickness instead of actually making you healthy, which we all secretly know that. I mean, it's almost not even secret. That's why there's no money in curing things. When's the last time anything was cured? Because they want to just treat you forever. I mean, guys, it's not even secret. It's just basic stuff. Now, these apply to kind of different scenarios, access to water and so on, which, by the way, our government's violating this in many other ways around the world in regard to foreign policy and so on. But that's another conversation. Sharing of benefits. This is talking about, it's interesting the U.S. government has been odd in the way that they tried to buy other people's vaccines or tried to make sure it was only for the United States if they did. So it seems to violate that in its own right. Protecting future generations, the impact of life sciences on future generations, including on their genetic constitution, should be given due regard. Has anybody had that conversation? Have you even heard them discuss the possibility of genetic changes? Of course not, because that would cause vaccine hesitancy, despite how true it is. So they just ignore it, despite the fact that they're currently violating that in regard to informed consent, in regard to making sure that the impact on life sciences and future generations by a vaccine that they don't know what will happen long term, that should be considered. But they're not. It's violating this compact and every other aspect we've talked about. Protection of the environment. But let's pretend in any way that's even happening in regard to the fact that the U.S. military, regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican is in the office, in the presidency, is always the world's most prolific polluter. That's not a secret. Easy to look up. The U.S. military pollutes more than any other entity on the planet. But yet then we fight about global climate change and all these different things, and except we just let it keep happening. If you really cared about that, of course, they argue that, well, because we're spreading freedom and democracy as we literally steal those things every step we take. Yeah, but just shut up about it. Just take our word for it. They're not doing any of those things. And even in regard to biodiversity, I mean, these are all biosphere, biodiversity. It says due regards to be given to the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life. Such as how when the Navy tests their sonar devices in the ocean and kills dolphins and whales and all these things, which is, I mean, you may not be aware of that actually. I've written articles about it. Unbelievable. It happens constantly. Maybe not a lot. It happens a lot. They test these things. They kill a lot of animals. There's an acceptable amount of death. You can look it up on the Navy's, I think it's on one of their websites in regard to their testing. I've covered it before. Is that respect of the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life? Obviously not. They do not care about these things. The importance of appropriate access to the utilization of biological and genetic resources, to respect for traditional knowledge and the role of human beings in the protection of the environment, the biosphere, and biodiversity. Decision-making and addressing bioethical issues. Professionalism, honesty, integrity, and transparency. You realize that Operation Warp Speed is just about the least transparent health agenda that we've ever seen in this country. They are not allowing even the FDA to sit at the table. Whitney and I already went over this. Added to the list of things they're breaking here. Now it says ethics committees, risk assessment. Let's just jump to the last part here. Those are the main points that I wanted to see. And I hope, I really want these to be remembered. The fact that you have the right to remove your consent. You have the right to, your rights have precedent over, or what's the word they use? They're more important than society as a whole. They take precedent. But Article 27, limitations on the applications of the principles. If the application of the principles of this declaration is to be limited, it should be by law, including laws in the interest of public safety, which seems to be the opposite, or at least that's what they're using to pretend they're doing it, even though what they're doing is literally ignoring safety. It's crazy. For the investigation, detection, and prosecution of criminal offenses. I forgot this thing refreshes itself. It's weird. For the protection of public health, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Any such law needs to be consistent with international human rights law, which, by the way, it's not. So you see where we're going here, guys? Do you understand how important this is in regard to why those things aren't being regarded and that the U.S. would sign it and just not care? But let's be clear here, guys. I'm talking about the U.S. government because that's where I am and that's where I'm concerned about the direction, but we're talking about the world in general. The UN here, guys. Every part of the UN. all the other people that are involved in the United Nations, right? You can name all the U.S. people that you don't like as well, right? The point is that they're all violating this stuff. That's why I begin to, we need to begin to realize that there's a larger agenda taking place around the world. It's not just the U.S., just the U.K., just Israel, just Saudi Arabia. There's a larger thing happening right now. It shows you how reaching and controlling this whole thing really is, whatever you want to call that. Now, moving on to the vaccine discussion and the resistance to it, I wanted to point this out because I knew this has already changed. Just so you know, right off the bat, apparently this has already been reversed because of the protests. But in Denmark, it says 9 days. Now, realize nobody talked about this other than independent media. 9 days of protests. Where was the mainstream? Do they not care about this? Apparently not. They just realize how quickly they will report on protests that they want you to see, where people are doing violent things, but never will, which, if they are, no longer becomes a protest. In this case, they don't want you to see this because it's honest, genuine, organic protest against exactly the thing that they don't want you to protest. 9 days of protest over the new law. It's a new law in Denmark that would be able to define groups of people who must be vaccinated. People who refuse the above can be coerced through physical detainment with police allowed to assist. That's crazy. So you can see this says explained. What is Denmark's proposed epidemic law and why is it being criticized? I just had this one part highlighted. It's just incredible. It says some areas in the proposed law that have raised eyebrows. People infected with dangerous disease can be forcibly given medical examination, hospitalized, treated, and placed in isolation. So you can be forced to take a vaccine if this law were to pass. The Danish Health Authority would be able to define groups of people who must be vaccinated in order to contain and eliminate a dangerous disease. People who refuse the above can, in some situations, be coerced through physical detainment with the police allowed to assist. This is not conspiracy theory. And as I said, I guess I don't have it up. But as I say, in general, the point was, for all those people that are saying this is all conspiracy theory, right? I mean, if this is very clearly what the government here is trying to accomplish. They want to be able to force you to take the vaccine.